The Chamber of the United Nations had witnessed countless confrontations, but this one carried a different weight. It was not loud at first, no raised voices, no dramatic walkouts. Instead, the tension settled slowly as Somalia took the floor and framed its statement with deliberate precision. Every word was measured, every phrase. Sharpened by history, sovereignty, and unresolved wounds, Somalia spoke of unity. It spoke of borders inherited, defended, and paid for through decades of struggle. It spoke of a nation that had survived fragmentation, external pressure, and internal conflict, only to rebuild around a single principle: territorial integrity. The message was clear long before Israel was mentioned. This was not a routine diplomatic exchange. It was an accusation delivered through law, memory, and warning.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also want to thank Deputy Special Coordinator, Mr. Alakbarov, and the ASG, Ms. Mirsuya, and Ms. Ashen of the Save the Children for their sobering briefings today. I have also listened carefully to the testimony of Mr. Ilana Gursky and sympathize with the suffering endured by her and by all the families in this conflict. Mr. President, we are gravely concerned by Israel's recent announcement to impose total military control over the entire Gaza Strip, as well as the expansion of the new settlement in East Jerusalem. We also condemn Israel's bombing of Nasser Medical Complex in Khan Yunis, which resulted in the death of innocent, unarmed civilians, including doctors, journalists, and patients. These actions risk the prospect of achieving lasting peace and further compound an already dire situation in Gaza and the West Bank. The latest IBC report has removed any doubt about what's happening in Gaza. Famine is no longer looming. It's a man-made famine, and it's happening in Gaza. The death of children from hunger and disease is not a forecast, it's a fact. Entire families are starving in full view of this Council, despite the presence of international humanitarian system that could save them if only they were allowed to act. Let us be absolutely clear. Famine in Gaza is not an natural occurrence caused by drought, failed harvest, or sudden catastrophic beyond human control. It's a man-made, deliberately created through a siege, blockade, and systematic obstruction by Israelis. The international humanitarian law is explicit. The starvation of civilians as a method of warfare is a genocide and is prohibited. Attacks on objects indispensable to survival, food stocks, water systems, agriculture, medical facilities are prohibited under international humanitarian law. The Fourth Geneva Convention requires the occupying power to ensure the welfare of the civilian population under its control. Mr. President, Somalia stresses the following points. First, a blockade must be lifted, not partially, not temporarily, not heroically, but fully and immediately. Every day of a delay means more children are buried, more families are lost. Crossings must be opened and kept open. Second, humanitarian access must be sustained, predictable at scale. Aid convoys carrying fuel, medicine, and essential goods must be allowed to flow without arbitrary inspections, delays, or denials. Third, civilian infrastructures must be protected. Hospitals, bakeries, water networks, schools are not legitimate targets. Fourth, we call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and reiterate our call for an immediate release of civilian hostages and detainees. Mr. President, the images and reports coming from Gaza are not abstract. They are skeletal children without access to therapeutic food. They are mothers unable to produce milk for their newborn because they themselves are starving. Their hospitals turned into morgues because generators have run dry. This is the daily reality of the people deliberately held hostage to hunger as a collective punishment, which is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. What we are witnessing is not security, it's a collective punishment, and it's a genocide. Mr. President, we call on this Council to act with urgency and clarity, demand the immediate lifting of the blockade, ensure full, safe, unhindered humanitarian access by all routes and means, protect civilians and humanitarian workers without exception, call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, and recommit to a political process that ends the occupation and delivers a just and lasting peace in the Middle East. Somalia reaffirms its unwavering support for the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, including the right of self-determination to establish an independent, sovereign state of Palestine on the borders of 1967 with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital, in accordance with the relevant UN resolutions.
The alleged plot did not appear suddenly. For months, whispers had circulated through diplomatic corridors and regional briefings. Analysts spoke quietly about external engagements with subnational actors in the Horn of Africa. Development projects, security discussions, and trade talks were scrutinized for subtext. What some saw as pragmatic engagement, Somalia interpreted as something far more dangerous. At the United Nations, Somalia named the concern without hesitation. The accusations centered on interference, on the legitimization of separation, and on actions that could encourage the division of a sovereign African state. The language was firm but restrained, designed to resonate beyond emotion. Somalia framed the issue not as a bilateral grievance, but as a test of international norms, Israel's presence in the chamber was silent but unmistakable. Diplomats listened carefully as Somalia outlined its case. References were made to international law, to African Union principles, and to United Nations resolutions emphasizing the inviolability of borders. Somalia did not rely on rhetoric alone, it relied on precedent. Africa's reaction was immediate. Several African countries signaled support through nods, statements, and coordinated language. In subsequent interventions, the memory of partition, both colonial and post-independence, remained vivid across the continent. Somalia's warning struck a familiar chord. What happened to one could echo across many. Israel responded cautiously. Its statement emphasized cooperation, development, and regional stability. Any suggestion of deliberate division was rejected. Israel framed its actions as pragmatic engagement driven by security and economic considerations, not territorial ambition. Yet the denial did little to diffuse the underlying concern. The clash exposed deeper fault lines. At its core, the dispute was not solely about Somalia and Israel. It reflected a broader tension between state sovereignty and evolving diplomatic practices. As global power shifted and traditional alliances loosened, new forms of engagement emerged. Some states welcomed flexibility, others saw risk. Somalia's argument gained strength from context. The Horn of Africa sat at a crossroads of global trade routes, security interests, and geopolitical competition. External involvement had often promised stability but delivered fragmentation. Somalia positioned itself as a case study in the dangers of bypassing central authority. The accusation of shame was not personal, it was institutional. Somalia argued that actions taken outside recognized frameworks undermined the credibility of international law. If sovereignty could be selectively interpreted, then no state was truly secure. The United Nations chamber absorbed the implication. Silence followed the statement, not from indifference, but from calculation. Delegations weighed alliances, precedents, and future implications. Supporting Somalia meant defending rigid interpretations of sovereignty. Supporting Israel's position meant accepting a more fluid diplomatic landscape. Public reaction spread quickly. African media framed the moment as a rare assertion of agency at the global level. Somalia was not pleading for intervention, it was demanding respect. The narrative resonated with populations familiar with external influence shaping internal outcomes. In Israel, commentary focused on strategic misunderstanding. Analysts questioned whether engagement in the Horn of Africa had been misread or poorly communicated. The emphasis shifted toward damage control, reassurance, and clarification. Yet the spotlight remained fixed. Western countries responded with caution. Statements emphasized dialogue, investigation, and restraint. No side was explicitly endorsed. The priority appeared to be containment of escalation rather than resolution of principle. Somalia remained firm. In follow-up remarks, it reiterated that cooperation was welcome, but only through recognized national institutions. Any engagement that elevated alternative authorities was unacceptable. The line was drawn clearly. The African Union echoed the concern. Without naming Israel directly, it reaffirmed commitment to territorial integrity and warned against actions that could encourage fragmentation. This regional backing strengthened Somalia's position and internationalized the issue further. The clash revealed a shifting balance. African states were increasingly willing to confront perceived overreach, even by technologically advanced or diplomatically influential countries. The assumption that smaller or recovering states would remain silent no longer held. Israel faced a recalibration. Its expanding relationships across Africa had been built on mutual benefit, technology exchange, and security cooperation. The Somalia confrontation exposed the limits of engagement that did not fully align with continental norms. The United Nations once again became a mirror. It reflected a world where old rules were tested by new strategies, where sovereignty competed with pragmatism, where emerging voices demanded equal weight. As the session concluded, no resolution was adopted, but the impact lingered. Diplomats carried the tension into private meetings. Policy papers were revised, engagement strategies reconsidered. Somalia had achieved something significant. It had shifted the conversation from quiet maneuvering to open accountability. It had framed division, not as a local issue, but as a global risk. The clash did not end relations, but it altered them. Trust required rebuilding. Communication required clarity. The Horn of Africa, already sensitive, became even more carefully watched. In the end, the moment was less about shaming and more about signaling. Somalia signaled that sovereignty was non-negotiable. Africa signaled solidarity. The international system signaled uncertainty. And Israel, like many global actors, was reminded that in a changing world, influence without consent could provoke resistance, even in the most formal halls of global power.